Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that sounds boring on paper, but gets horrifying fast. The story of a back pain pill that was supposed to save lives and ended up destroying them by the thousands. We're talking about OxyContin, the little beige tablet that pharmaceutical companies swore was perfectly safe, doctors handed out like candy, and patients discovered was basically heroin in a bottle. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your curiosity shapes what we cover, and I'm genuinely grateful for it. If you're finding these stories helpful for sleep, we're now live on Spotify too, so check the link in the description if you'd like to listen there. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how a single medication could slip past every safety check? How did doctors who took an oath to do no harm become the biggest drug dealers in America? What happens when a family company decides profit matters more than people? How do you market addiction as pain relief? And what does it feel like to trust your doctor completely, only to find yourself stealing from your kid's piggy bank to buy your next dose? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1996, the year a pharmaceutical company is about to change the face of American medicine forever, and not in a good way. But the villains of our story, except they didn't look like villains. They looked like philanthropists. The Sackler family, wealthy, refined, patrons of the arts, had their names carved into museum wings at the Met, the Louvre and Oxford. They funded medical schools. They donated to hospitals. They were, by all appearances, generous, cultured, and deeply committed to the betterment of humanity. But here's the thing about appearances. They're really, really good at lying. The Sackler name glittered on marble walls across the world. Walk into the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and you'd pass through the Sackler wing, housing the ancient Temple of Denda. Visit the Louvre in Paris, and you'd find Sackler rooms filled with Persian artifacts. Stroll through Oxford University, and you'd stumble upon the Sackler Library. Their generosity seemed boundless, their taste impeccable, their commitment to human knowledge and beauty unquestionable. Arthur Sackler, the patriarch who started it all, was a brilliant man, a psychiatrist, an art collector, a pioneer in medical advertising. He died in 1987, before OxyContin ever existed, but he laid the groundwork for everything that followed. He understood something fundamental about American culture. If you donate enough money to the right institutions, people stop asking questions about where that money came from. His brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, along with their children, took that lesson to heart. They built an empire on pills, then wrapped that empire in the respectable cloak of cultural philanthropy. Here's what's brilliant about the strategy, in a deeply evil way. When you fund a museum wing, you're not just buying naming rights, you're buying legitimacy. You're transforming yourself from a pharmaceutical executive into a patron of the arts, a benefactor of humanity. Suddenly, you're not the person profiting from painkillers. You're the person who made it possible for millions to view ancient Egyptian temples. You're not a drug dealer. You're a lover of Persian miniatures. It's reputation laundering at its finest, and the Sacklers were masters of it. But while their names adorned museum galleries, their company, Purdue Pharma, was quietly making them billions. The family controlled the company completely. It wasn't publicly traded, so there were no shareholders to answer to, no board of directors asking uncomfortable questions. It was their private kingdom, and what happened inside stayed inside. The Sacklers attended galas in tuxedos and evening gowns, rubbed elbows with celebrities and politicians, and smiled for photographs beside priceless works of art. Meanwhile, back at Purdue headquarters, executives were designing marketing strategies that would hook millions of Americans on opioids. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Imagine donating millions to medical schools to train the next generation of doctors while simultaneously engineering a drug crisis that would kill hundreds of thousands of patients. It's like funding the fire department while secretly setting fires. But that's exactly what the Sacklers did, and for decades it worked. People saw the museums, the libraries, the scholarships. They didn't see the prescriptions, the addiction, the coffins. Even their philanthropy had a certain coldness to it. They didn't fund homeless shelters or addiction treatment centres, places that might have forced them to confront the human cost of their wealth. They funded institutions that celebrated beauty, knowledge, and culture. Abstract things, clean things, things that had nothing to do with the messy reality of pain, dependence, and death their products were creating. It was wealth spent to avoid accountability, generosity designed to distract from greed. And for a long time, it worked perfectly. The Sacklers weren't cartoon villains twirling moustaches in dark rooms. They were respectable. They were cultured. They were, by every outward measure, pillars of society, which makes what they did even more chilling. Because if people like this, educated, refined, philanthropic, could engineer a public health catastrophe for profit, then who can you trust? The Sacklers didn't just donate money to medicine, they made it from medicine. Their company, Purdue Pharma, wasn't some faceless corporation run by strangers in boardrooms. It was a family operation, tightly controlled, quietly profitable, and about to become obscenely rich. For years, Purdue sold a modest painkiller called MS-Contin, a morphine-based drug for cancer patients. It worked. It helped people who were dying, and for a while, that seemed like enough. But then someone in a conference room asked a very American question. How do we make more money? Purdue Pharma was founded in 1952, originally making antiseptics and earwax removal products. Nothing glamorous, nothing controversial, just basic medical supplies. But when the Sackler brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, bought the company in 1952, they transformed it. They started focusing on pharmaceuticals, particularly painkillers, and they discovered something that would become their guiding principle. Selling drugs was incredibly profitable, especially if you could convince doctors to prescribe them liberally. MS-Contin, launched in 1984, was their first major success. It was a morphine pill with a controlled release mechanism designed for cancer patients in severe pain. The drug worked as intended. It helped people at the end of their lives manage unbearable suffering. There was nothing particularly sinister about it. But it had one major limitation. The market was small. Only so many people have terminal cancer. Only so many need round-the-clock morphine. For a company looking to grow, MS-Contin was a dead end, if you'll pardon the expression. So the executives at Purdue started thinking bigger. What if they could take that same controlled release technology and apply it to a drug with a much larger potential market? Not just cancer patients, but anyone with chronic pain. Back pain, arthritis, old sports injuries, migraines, conditions affecting millions of Americans. The market potential was staggering, and the more they thought about it, the more irresistible it became. Why limit themselves to the dying when they could medicate the living? Enter OxyContin, an opioid painkiller that had been around since 1917. It was powerful, about 1.5 times stronger than morphine, but it had a bad reputation. It was short-acting, which meant patients needed frequent doses, and it was known to be addictive. Doctors prescribed it cautiously, if at all. But Purdue saw potential. What if they took OxyContin and wrapped it in that same controlled release coating they'd used for MS-Contin? What if they could make it last 12 hours instead of 4? What if they could market it as safer, smoother, less prone to abuse? And so OxyContin was born. The name itself was calculated. Oxy from oxycodone, Contin from continuous release. It sounded scientific, clinical, trustworthy. The pill came in doses ranging from 10 milligrams to a jaw-dropping 160 milligrams, the kind of firepower previously reserved for end-stage cancer patients. But Purdue had bigger plans. They wanted OxyContin prescribed not just in hospices, but in family doctor offices, dental clinics, urgent care centres. They wanted it everywhere. What's important to understand is that Purdue wasn't some rogue operation hidden in a basement. It was a legitimate pharmaceutical company, operating with FDA approval, staffed by scientists and researchers who genuinely believed they were creating something helpful. But at the top, steering the ship, were the Sacklers, family members who served on the board, who approved marketing strategies, who pushed for aggressive sales targets. They weren't distant shareholders collecting dividends. They were hands-on owners who knew exactly what they were doing. And what they were doing, quite simply, was turning pain into profit. Not just the pain of the dying, but the pain of the living. Chronic pain, everyday pain, the kind of pain that millions of Americans wake up with every morning. They saw suffering, and they saw dollar signs. And in 1996 they launched a product that would make them richer than they'd ever dreamed, and kill more people than they could have imagined. Purdue Pharma wasn't evil because it was big or corporate. It was evil because it was small, controlled, and calculating. A family business that treated addiction like a growth opportunity. In the early 1990s, American medicine had a problem. Millions of people suffered from chronic pain, back pain, arthritis, migraines, old injuries that never quite healed. And doctors didn't know what to do with them. They handed out ibuprofen, told patients to stretch more, and secretly suspected some of them were just complaining. Meanwhile, opioids existed. Powerful painkillers derived from the opium poppy, the same plant that gives us heroin. But doctors were terrified of them. Prescribe too much, and your patient becomes an addict. Prescribe too little, and they suffer. It was a tightrope no one wanted to walk. Pain, especially chronic pain, was medicine's dirty secret. Doctors were trained to diagnose diseases, fix broken bones, cure infections, problems with clear solutions. But chronic pain, that was murky territory. There was no blood test for it, no X-ray that showed suffering, no objective measurement. Patients came in saying they hurt, and doctors had to decide whether to believe them. Some did, some didn't, and the ones who didn't believe them often sent patients away with nothing more than a shrug and a recommendation to try yoga. This created a massive, frustrated population of people living in constant agony. Factory workers with ruined backs from decades of lifting. Office workers with migraines that turned entire days into blurry nightmares. Elderly patients whose arthritis made every movement feel like grinding glass. Veterans whose old combat injuries never healed quite right. And they were all begging for help, for anything that would let them live normally again. But the medical establishment had tied its own hands. Why? Because of the opioid panic of the 1970s and 1980s. America had just lived through a heroin epidemic. Images of strung-out addicts in inner cities filled the news. The war on drugs was in full swing. Opioids were the enemy, and anyone who used them, even for legitimate pain, was viewed with suspicion. Doctors who prescribed too many painkillers risked being investigated by the DEA, losing their licenses, or even going to prison. So they erred on the side of caution, which in practice meant letting patients suffer. But here's the cruel irony. Opioids work. They really do. For thousands of years, humans have known that opium and its derivatives can eliminate pain like nothing else. Morphine, given to soldiers on battlefields, saved countless lives by making unbearable injuries bearable. When used carefully in the right circumstances, opioids are medical miracles. The problem was never the drugs themselves, it was how they were used and who controlled them. By the 1990s, a movement started gaining traction in medical circles. The idea that pain was being undertreated in America. Advocates argued that doctors were so afraid of addiction that they were letting patients suffer needlessly. They pushed for pain to be treated as the fifth vital sign, something doctors should assess alongside blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, and breathing. They argued that chronic pain was a disease in itself, not just a symptom, and that it deserved aggressive treatment. On paper, this sounded compassionate. In practice, it opened the door for what came next. Pharmaceutical companies watched this shift with great interest. Here was a massive market, millions of pain sufferers, and a medical establishment slowly warming to the idea of prescribing opioids more liberally. All they needed was a product that seemed safe enough to overcome doctors' lingering fears. A painkiller that worked like morphine but didn't carry the stigma. Something that could be marketed as modern, scientific, and most importantly, non-addictive. Enter Purdue Pharma, right on cue, with a solution that sounded too good to be true. And it was. The stage was set. Patients were desperate. Doctors were conflicted. Regulators were cautiously optimistic. And into this moment of vulnerability, Purdue would launch OxyContin, promising to solve the pain crisis once and for all. What they actually did was replace one crisis with another, swapping untreated pain for mass addiction. But in 1996, nobody saw it coming. All they saw was hope wrapped in a time-release coating. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin with a promise that sounded too good to be true. It was a new kind of painkiller, stronger than most, longer lasting than anything on the market, and here's the kicker, supposedly non-addictive. The drug was oxycodone, an opioid similar to morphine, but Purdue wrapped it in a fancy time-release coating. Take one pill, they said, and it releases slowly over 12 hours. No highs, no lows, no addiction, just smooth, steady pain relief. Doctors exhaled in relief. Patients cried tears of gratitude. Purdue executives, they started counting money. But there was one tiny problem. It was all a lie. OxyContin's launch was carefully orchestrated. Purdue positioned it as a breakthrough, a pharmaceutical innovation that would transform pain management. The time-release mechanism was the key selling point. Unlike older painkillers that flooded your system all at once and then wore off quickly, OxyContin supposedly delivered a steady, controlled dose over 12 hours. 2 pills a day, morning and night, and you'd be covered. No more watching the clock, waiting for your next dose. No more roller coaster of relief and agony. Just consistent, predictable comfort. The FDA approved OxyContin in December 1995, and on the label, Purdue managed to get language that would prove catastrophic. Delayed absorption, as provided by OxyContin tablets, is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug. Read that again. The FDA essentially gave Purdue permission to claim their drug was less addictive because of how it was designed. This wasn't based on long-term studies or extensive clinical trials. It was based on theory, on the belief that slow release meant lower risk. And Purdue took that single sentence and ran with it like they'd just won the pharmaceutical lottery. The marketing materials were slick, confident, and everywhere. Sales representatives fanned out across America armed with glossy brochures showing happy patients gardening, playing with grandchildren, living full lives free from pain. The message was clear. OxyContin gives people their lives back, and unlike those scary opioids from the past, this one is safe. Look, the FDA even said so. Doctors who had spent years anxiously avoiding opioid prescriptions suddenly had permission to prescribe freely. It was liberating for them, honestly. Finally, They could help their suffering patients without fearing they were creating addicts. But here's what Purdue didn't tell anyone. The 12-hour claim was shaky at best. Clinical trials showed that for many patients, the drug wore off well before 12 hours. Some patients felt relief for only 8 hours, or even 6. And when it wore off, the pain came roaring back, often worse than before, something called breakthrough pain. But instead of admitting the 12-hour formulation didn't work for everyone, Purdue's solution was simple: increase the dose. If 80 milligrams isn't lasting 12 hours, try 120. Still not enough. Go to 160. This created a vicious cycle. Higher doses meant stronger effects, but also faster tolerance and deeper dependence. Patients weren't just treating pain anymore. They were chasing a relief that kept slipping further away. And many started to notice something else. The pills made them feel good. Really good. That wasn't supposed to happen with a non-addictive medication, but there it was. Warm, euphoric glow that made problems seem distant and life seem manageable. Some patients, desperate for relief or simply curious, discovered that if you crushed the pill and snorted or injected it, you bypassed the time-release coating entirely and got an instant, overwhelming high. Purdue knew. Internal documents later revealed that the company was aware OxyContin was being abused as early as 1997, barely a year after launch. Sales reps reported hearing about patients crushing pills. Pharmacists flagged suspicious prescriptions. Doctors raised concerns. But instead of pulling back, Purdue doubled down. They blamed patients for misusing the medication. They blamed doctors for not monitoring closely enough. They blamed everyone except themselves. Meanwhile, prescriptions soared. Family doctors prescribed OxyContin for back pain. Dentists prescribed it after wisdom tooth extractions. Surgeons prescribed it after routine procedures. It became the default answer to pain, any pain, everywhere. And Purdue's revenues exploded. Within a few years, OxyContin was bringing in over $1 billion annually. The Sacklers were getting richer by the hour. And across America, people were discovering that the safe painkiller they'd been promised was actually destroying their lives, one 12-hour dose at a time. The safe solution was a Trojan horse, and by the time anyone realized what was inside, it was far too late. Purdue didn't just release OxyContin, they unleashed it. The company launched one of the most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing campaigns in American history. Sales reps were sent to doctors' offices armed with charts, studies, and one very specific message: OxyContin is safe. Less than 1% of patients become addicted. You can prescribe it freely. Don't let your patients suffer. They brought in lunch, handed out branded pens and notepads, and sometimes even offered all expenses-paid trips to pain management seminars in sunny resort towns. The studies they cited, funded by Purdue, the 1% addiction claim, based on a single paragraph in a medical journal that was never meant to apply to long-term opioid use. Purdue hired an army, literally hundreds of sales representatives whose sole job was to convince doctors to prescribe OxyContin as often as possible. These weren't just any sales reps. They were trained, coached, and incentivized with aggressive bonus structures tied directly to prescribing rates in their territories. The more pills prescribed, the bigger the paycheck. Some reps made six-figure incomes. They dressed well, spoke confidently, and projected an air of medical authority, even though most had no medical training beyond what Purdue taught them. The tactics were sophisticated. Sales reps didn't just show up and pitch a product. They built relationships. They learned doctors' names, their hobbies, their families. They brought catered lunches to medical offices, often expensive spreads from nice restaurants. They handed out branded swag, pens, notepads, coffee mugs, even plush toys. One infamous example, Purdue distributed OxyContin-branded music CDs with titles like Get in the Swing with OxyContin. Nothing says serious medication like a swing jazz soundtrack. But the real genius of the campaign was the messaging. Purdue didn't just say OxyContin was effective, they said it was safe. They hammered home the idea that addiction risk was minimal, citing that infamous less than 1% statistic over and over. That number came from a 5-sentence letter to the editor published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980. The letter reviewed hospitalized patients who received opioids and found that only 4 out of nearly 12,000 developed addiction. But here's the problem. Those patients were in controlled hospital settings, receiving short-term pain relief under close supervision. The study said nothing about long-term outpatient use, nothing about chronic pain, nothing about people taking pills at home for months or years. Purdue took that letter, stripped it of context, and weaponized it. Sales reps presented it as definitive proof that OxyContin was safe for everyone, everywhere, all the time. Doctors, overwhelmed and eager to help their suffering patients, believed it. Why wouldn't they? It was published in one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, and Purdue's sales reps seemed so confident, so knowledgeable, so trustworthy. Purdue also funded continuing medical education programs, sponsoring conferences and seminars where doctors learned about pain management. These events were often held at resorts and hotels, with free registration, meals, and sometimes travel expenses covered. The speakers, paid consultants, many of whom had financial ties to Purdue. They delivered presentations emphasizing that pain was undertreated in America and that opioids were the solution. They downplayed addiction risks and encouraged aggressive prescribing. Doctors left these seminars feeling educated, empowered, and ready to prescribe more OxyContin. The company targeted specific regions and specific types of doctors. They identified areas with high rates of workplace injuries, coal mining towns in Appalachia, industrial regions in the Midwest, logging communities in the Pacific Northwest. They focused on general practitioners, the frontline doctors most likely to see patients with chronic pain. And they zeroed in on high prescribers, doctors who were already comfortable writing opioid prescriptions, and showered them with attention. Some doctors were invited to become paid speakers themselves, earning thousands of dollars to give talks promoting OxyContin. Purdue's marketing budget for OxyContin was massive, over $200 million in the first few years alone. That's more than most blockbuster movies spend on advertising, and it worked. Between 1996 and 2001, OxyContin prescriptions increased tenfold. The drug went from a niche product to one of the most prescribed medications in America. Purdue's sales soared past $1 billion annually, and the Sackler family fortune grew by billions. But beneath the glossy brochures and catered lunches, the truth was festering. Patients were getting addicted, emergency rooms were filling up, people were dying. And Purdue knew, because their sales reps were reporting it back. But the company didn't sound the alarm. They didn't pull back. They kept selling, kept marketing, kept insisting everything was fine. Because in the world of pharmaceutical sales, safety was just another marketing message. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Doctors are human. They want to help. They want to fix things. And when a friendly sales rep shows up with a solution to a problem they've been struggling with for years, they listen. OxyContin wasn't just marketed as effective, it was marketed as guilt-free. You're not creating addicts, they were told. You're treating pain. Besides, the FDA had approved it. Major medical journals discussed it. Pain management experts endorsed it. Why wouldn't you prescribe it? And so they did. Family doctors in small towns, surgeons after routine procedures, dentists after wisdom tooth extractions. OxyContin spread like wildfire through American medicine. Let's be clear, Most doctors who prescribed OxyContin weren't villains. They weren't getting kickbacks in shady parking lots or deliberately hooking patients. They were exhausted primary care physicians seeing 30 patients a day, trying to help people who came in limping, wincing, begging for relief. They were surgeons who wanted their patients to recover comfortably. They were dentists who thought they were being compassionate after a tooth extraction. They were human beings trying to do good, and Purdue exploited that. For years, doctors had felt helpless in the face of chronic pain. They'd see the same patients month after month, people whose lives were defined by suffering, and they'd have almost nothing to offer. Physical therapy helped some. Anti-inflammatories helped a little. But many patients kept coming back, desperate and deteriorating. It was demoralizing for everyone involved. So when Purdue showed up promising a safe, effective solution, doctors wanted to believe it. They needed to believe it. The FDA approval carried enormous weight. Doctors are trained to trust regulatory agencies. If the FDA says a drug is safe and effective, that's supposed to mean something. It's supposed to mean the drug has been rigorously tested, that the benefits outweigh the risks, that experts have reviewed the data and given their stamp of approval. So when OxyContin's label included language suggesting it had reduced abuse liability, doctors took that seriously. They assumed it meant the drug had been proven safer than older opioids. They didn't realize that claim was based on theory, not evidence. The medical literature seemed to support Purdue's claims too. Articles in respected journals discussed the undertreatment of pain and advocated for more aggressive use of opioids. Many of these articles didn't disclose that their authors had financial ties to Purdue. Some were ghostwritten by Purdue's marketing team and then signed by prominent physicians. Doctors reading these articles had no idea they were essentially reading advertisements disguised as science. Then there were the continuing medical education seminars. Doctors are required to complete ongoing education to maintain their licenses, and Purdue helped fund many of these programs. The conferences were pleasant, good food, nice venues, interesting talks. The message was always the same: pain is undertreated, opioids are the answer, and addiction risk is overblown. Doctors left feeling like they'd learned something valuable, not realizing they'd just attended a very expensive infomercial. Many doctors also faced pressure from patients themselves. Once word got out that OxyContin worked, that it really did eliminate pain, patients started asking for it by name. They'd come in having heard about it from friends or family, having researched it online, armed with printouts and determination. Some doctors resisted, but others figured, why not? If the patient is suffering and there's a medication that can help, isn't prescribing it the compassionate thing to do? There was also the issue of pain as the fifth vital sign. Hospitals and medical organizations had been pushing doctors to take pain seriously, to assess it at every visit, to treat it aggressively. Patient satisfaction surveys asked about pain management. Doctors who didn't adequately address pain could be downgraded in evaluations. In some settings, a patient's pain score became as important as their blood pressure. This created an environment where prescribing OxyContin wasn't just acceptable, it was expected. But here's where things get complicated. Some doctors did notice problems. They saw patients becoming dependent, requesting early refills, exhibiting drug-seeking behavior. Some stopped prescribing OxyContin altogether. Others tightened their protocols, requiring frequent office visits and urine tests. But many others simply assumed their patients were anomalies, bad apples misusing an otherwise safe medication. They didn't connect the dots, they didn't see the pattern, and Purdue encouraged that thinking. When concerns were raised, the company blamed patients, not the drug. They suggested that addiction was a personal failing, a result of misuse rather than a predictable consequence of long-term opioid exposure. They told doctors to screen patients better, to monitor more closely, to prescribe responsibly, all while pushing them to prescribe more. The tragedy is that doctors believed they were doing the right thing. They thought they were alleviating suffering. They thought they were following evidence-based medicine. They didn't realize they were foot soldiers in a corporate marketing campaign designed to maximize profits, regardless of the human cost. And by the time many of them figured it out, their patients were already addicted, already suffering, already dying. Imagine you're a patient in 1997. You've lived with chronic back pain for years. You've tried physical therapy, heating pads, stretches, ibuprofen. Nothing works. Every morning you wake up in agony. Then your doctor hands you a prescription, OxyContin. This will change your life, they say. And at first, it does. The pain melts away. You can sleep through the night. You can play with your kids again. You can go back to work without wincing. For the first time in years, you feel normal. You feel human. It's a miracle. Except miracles, in medicine, usually come with fine print. You take the first pill with a glass of water, sitting in your kitchen, still skeptical because you've been disappointed before. You've tried everything, and nothing has worked for more than a few hours. But your doctor seemed confident this time, different. They said this medication was new, safe, designed specifically for people like you, people with real pain who need real relief. So you swallow the pill and wait. About 30 minutes later, something shifts. The constant background scream of pain that's been with you for months, maybe years, starts to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, like someone's turning down the volume on a radio that's been blaring in your head. Your shoulders relax, your jaw unclenches. You realize you've been holding your breath for so long you've forgotten what it feels like to exhale. And now you can. The relief isn't just physical, it's emotional, almost spiritual. You feel like you've been given your life back. By the second day, you're a believer. You sleep through the night for the first time in months. You wake up without that immediate dread of having to move, having to stand, having to face another day in pain. You can bend down to tie your shoes without wincing. You can pick up your daughter without that sharp, stabbing sensation in your lower back. You go to the grocery store and walk the aisles without needing to lean on the cart for support. Strangers don't give you pitying looks anymore because you're not moving like someone twice your age. Your family notices too. Your spouse comments that you seem happier, lighter. Your kids are thrilled that you want to play with them again. You go to a cookout with friends, and for once you're not sitting in a chair in the corner, declining invitations to join activities, because you know your body can't handle it. You're participating, you're laughing, you're living, and all of it traces back to those little beige pills sitting in the orange bottle on your bathroom counter. You tell everyone who will listen about this miracle medication. Your co-worker with a bad knee. You recommend OxyContin. Your neighbour who threw out their back-moving furniture. You tell them to ask their doctor about it. You're not being paid to spread the word. You're just genuinely grateful, genuinely convinced that this medication is changing lives. And in those first few weeks, maybe even months, you're not wrong. It is changing your life. But here's what you don't know yet. Here's what nobody told you. Your brain is changing. With every dose, opioid receptors in your nervous system are being flooded with chemicals that essentially tell your body, don't worry about pain. Don't worry about anything. Everything is fine. And your brain, adaptable organ that it is, starts to adjust. It begins to expect those chemicals. It starts to need them. You don't feel it happening. There's no alarm bell, no warning light that goes off in your consciousness. You just keep taking the pills as prescribed, 2 a day, 12 hours apart, just like the bottle says. You're being a good patient. You're following doctor's orders. You're doing everything right. And that's the insidious part. You're developing a dependency while doing exactly what you're supposed to do. Around week 6 or 8, you notice something odd. The pills don't seem to last quite as long as they used to. You take your morning dose at 8, and by 6 in the evening, 2 hours before your next dose, the pain starts creeping back. Not as bad as before you started the medication, but uncomfortable enough that you're watching the clock, waiting for 8 o'clock to arrive so you can take that second pill. You mention it to your doctor at your follow-up appointment, and they nod sympathetically. That's normal, they say. Your body has adjusted. Let's increase your dose. And just like that, your prescription goes from 80 milligrams a day to 120. Problem solved, right? The pain stays away again. Relief returns, but you've just taken the first step on a staircase that only goes down. You don't know it yet, but you're not just treating pain anymore. You're feeding a dependency, and that dependency is about to take over your life in ways you can't yet imagine. For now, though, you're still in the honeymoon phase. You're still grateful. You still believe this medication saved you. And in a way, it did, right before it started destroying you. OxyContin didn't just kill pain, it created euphoria. That time-release coating Purdue was so proud of, it could be bypassed. Crush the pill, snort it or inject it, and you got an instant, powerful high, stronger than heroin, cheaper than cocaine, and sold legally at your local pharmacy. But even people who took it exactly as prescribed started noticing something strange. They felt good, really good, too good. The world felt softer, warmer, problems seemed manageable, and then, when the pill wore off, the world felt unbearable. Let's talk about what euphoria actually means. It's not just happiness. It's not just feeling good after a nice meal or a beautiful sunset. Euphoria is a neurochemical flood, an overwhelming sense of well-being so intense that it rewires your brain's reward system. When opioids hit your receptors, they don't just block pain, they trigger a massive release of dopamine, the brain's pleasure chemical. You feel warm, safe, content, like every problem you've ever had just evaporated. It's what your brain imagines heaven might feel like. For some people taking OxyContin as prescribed, this euphoria was mild, just a pleasant sense of relaxation. But for others, especially those on higher doses, it was profound. They'd take their pill and within an hour feel waves of contentment washing over them. Stress disappeared, anxiety melted, depression lifted. The medication wasn't just treating their back pain, it was treating everything. Every emotional wound, every disappointment, every fear. And that was dangerous because emotional pain is just as real as physical pain, and OxyContin was solving both. But some people discovered the shortcut. If you crushed an OxyContin pill into powder, you destroyed that time-release coating Purdue kept bragging about. All the oxycodone that was supposed to be released slowly over 12 hours hit your system at once. Snort that powder, and within minutes you'd feel a rush so intense it buckled your knees. Inject it, and the effect was even more powerful. Users described it as better than any high they'd ever experienced, better than cocaine, better than heroin, better than anything. And here's the truly sinister part. Those pills were everywhere. You didn't need a drug dealer in a dark alley. You didn't need to know criminals or risk arrest buying illegal substances. You just needed a prescription, or a family member with a prescription, or a friend willing to share. OxyContin turned suburban medicine cabinets into pharmacies for addiction. Teenagers stole pills from their parents. College students bought them from classmates. People who'd never touched illegal drugs in their lives suddenly found themselves crushing pills on their nightstands. The high was so good that it created instant addicts. People who'd started taking OxyContin for legitimate pain, a car accident, a surgery, a work injury, would take their first crushed pill out of curiosity or desperation and immediately understand why this drug was different. One user later described it as meeting God. Another said it was like being wrapped in the warmest blanket you've ever felt, forever. These weren't dramatic exaggerations. This was their lived experience of a pharmaceutical-grade opioid hitting their brain all at once. But even among people who never crushed their pills, who never snorted or injected, euphoria became a problem. Because once you know how good the medication can make you feel, it's hard to take it just for pain. You start taking it when you're sad, when you're anxious, when you've had a bad day at work, when you're fighting with your spouse, when you're bored. The pills become a solution to life itself, not just to physical suffering. And then the tolerance builds. That warm glow that used to last hours starts fading faster. You need more to feel the same effect. Your prescribed dose stops working. You start taking pills a little closer together, maybe 10 hours instead of 12, then 8 hours, then 6. You tell yourself you're just managing breakthrough pain, but deep down, you know. You're chasing the feeling. You're chasing that moment when everything felt okay. What Purdue never mentioned in their glossy brochures, what sales reps didn't discuss during those catered lunches, was that euphoria isn't a side effect. It's a symptom. It's your brain's way of telling you that something powerful and dangerous is happening, that you've just activated ancient reward pathways that exist to reinforce survival behaviors like eating and sex. Except now, those pathways are being hijacked by a synthetic chemical, and they're going to demand more and more and more until there's nothing left of you but the craving. The high nobody mentioned became the elephant in every room, every doctor's office, every pharmacy line. People whispered about it but rarely spoke openly. Patients were ashamed to admit the pills made them feel good, because they thought it meant something was wrong with them, that they were weak or morally deficient. They didn't realize their brains were doing exactly what brains do when flooded with opioids, responding predictably to a predictable chemical stimulus. OxyContin didn't just offer pain, relief. It offered an escape, and for millions of Americans that escape turned into a trap. The human body is annoyingly adaptable. When you flood it with opioids, it adjusts. Receptors in your brain downregulate. The pain-killing effect fades, so you need more. Your doctor, noticing the pain is back, increases your dose. 80 milligrams a day becomes 120, then 160. And the cycle continues. You're not chasing a high, you're chasing normal. But normal keeps moving further away. This is tolerance, and it's the trapdoor beneath every opioid prescription. Tolerance sounds like a medical term, clean and clinical, something you might read in a textbook. But living through it feels like your body is gaslighting you. For the first few weeks or months, your OxyContin prescription works perfectly. The pain stays manageable. You take your pills on schedule. Life is good. Then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, something changes. The relief doesn't last quite as long. The pain starts sneaking back earlier. You find yourself watching the clock more, counting down the hours until your next dose. At first you think maybe you're imagining it. Maybe you just had a bad day, lifted something you shouldn't have, slept wrong, so you waited out. But the next day, same thing, and the next. The pills that used to carry you smoothly through 12 hours are now leaving you white-knuckling through the final 2 or 3 hours before your next dose. You're not taking more than prescribed. You're being responsible, but your body has quietly, methodically built up a tolerance. Here's what's happening on a cellular level, not that you know it or care because you're too busy hurting. Your opioid receptors, those specialized proteins on your nerve cells that respond to pain medication, have been soaking in oxycodone for weeks. Initially, they were sensitive, responsive, eager to do their job, but constant exposure makes them lazy. They start to downregulate, meaning your body produces fewer receptors or makes the existing ones less responsive. It's your brain's attempt at homeostasis, trying to return to its normal state despite the chemical interference. Your body is trying to protect itself, and in doing so, it's making the medication less effective. So you go back to your doctor. You explain that the pain is breaking through, that the medication isn't lasting as long as it used to. And your doctor, who's been trained by Purdue's materials to expect this, to see it as a normal part of pain management, increases your dose. Maybe you go from 80 milligrams daily to 120. Problem solved. The pain recedes again. Relief returns. You feel validated, reassured that you weren't imagining things, that your pain is real and deserves treatment. But you've just started a cycle that's nearly impossible to escape. Because that higher dose, your body will adapt to that too. Maybe not as quickly this time. Maybe it takes a few months instead of a few weeks. But it will happen. Receptors will downregulate again. Tolerance will build again. And you'll be back in the doctor's office, explaining again that the medication isn't working like it used to, asking again for an increase. Some patients end up on truly staggering doses. What started as 20 milligrams twice a day becomes 80 milligrams 3 times a day, then 160 milligrams twice a day. Doses that would have killed you when you first started taking the medication are now barely enough to keep you functional. You're not getting high, you're not even getting particularly good pain relief anymore. You're just maintaining, trying to stay ahead of the pain and the withdrawal symptoms that now arrive whenever the medication wears off. And here's the cruelest part. At a certain point, the pills stop treating your original pain and start treating the pain the pills themselves created. Your body has become so dependent on opioids that their absence causes physical suffering. You can't tell anymore where the old back pain ends and the opioid withdrawal begins. They blend together into one continuous nightmare of discomfort that only the pills can touch. You're not taking OxyContin to feel good. You're taking it to not feel terrible. Tolerance also creates a psychological trap. Every dose increase comes with a brief honeymoon period where the pain is under control again and life feels manageable. But that honeymoon gets shorter each time, and in the back of your mind a terrifying question starts forming. What happens when my doctor won't increase the dose anymore? What happens when I hit the ceiling and there's nowhere left to go? Some doctors, realizing their patients have developed tolerance, try to taper them down or switch them to different medications, but by this point, the patient's nervous system has been so thoroughly altered that reducing the dose causes immediate and severe withdrawal. So the doctor, wanting to avoid causing suffering, keeps the patient on high doses indefinitely. Other doctors, spooked by the patient's escalating needs, cut them off entirely, leaving them in agony and desperation. Neither option is good. Tolerance isn't a personal failing. It's not a sign of weakness or addiction, at least not initially. It's basic pharmacology, a predictable physiological response to chronic opioid exposure. But Purdue's marketing materials glossed over this reality. They made it seem like OxyContin could be taken indefinitely without problems, that dose increases were just fine-tuning rather than warning signs. They turned a red flag into standard practice. And so patients climbed the dosage ladder rung by rung, believing each increase was solving the problem, never realizing they were just postponing the inevitable fall. Tolerance leads to dependence, and dependence is where things get medieval. Your brain, after months of opioid exposure, stops producing its own natural painkillers, endorphins. It assumes the pills will handle it, so when you try to stop, even for a day, your body revolts, you sweat, you shake, your bones ache, you vomit, you can't sleep, you feel like you're dying, and the only thing that makes it stop. Another pill. You're not addicted because you're weak, you're addicted because your brain has been chemically hijacked. Let's be very clear about what dependence means. It doesn't mean you're morally weak or lack willpower. It means your body has adapted so completely to the presence of opioids that it can no longer function normally without them. Your brain's chemistry has been rewritten. The systems that regulate pain, mood, sleep, digestion, and even breathing have all recalibrated around the assumption that external opioids will be provided. Remove those opioids and everything falls apart. The first time you miss a dose, maybe you forget, maybe your prescription runs out early, maybe you're traveling and left your pills at home, you get a preview of what's coming. It starts subtle. 6 or 8 hours after your missed dose, you feel restless, uncomfortable. Your skin feels wrong, like your clothes are made of sandpaper. You can't get comfortable no matter how you sit or lie down. Your nose runs, your eyes water. You yawn constantly even though you're not particularly tired. By 12 hours, things escalate. You start sweating, but you're also cold. You pile on blankets, then throw them off minutes later. Your muscles ache, deep and relentless, like you've been beaten with hammers. Your legs feel particularly bad, a creeping, crawling sensation that makes you want to kick and move constantly. This is where the term kicking the habit comes from. The involuntary leg movements of opioid withdrawal. 24 hours in, you're in hell. Every symptom has intensified. You're vomiting even though there's nothing left in your stomach. You have diarrhea. You're sweating so much you have to change clothes multiple times. You can't sleep because your body won't let you rest. Your heart races. Your blood pressure spikes. You feel anxious, panicked, like something terrible is about to happen. And the pain, not your original pain, but a new all-encompassing agony that radiates from your bones and nerves, is unbearable. This is acute opioid withdrawal, and it's one of the most miserable experiences the human body can endure without dying. And here's the thing, unlike withdrawal from alcohol or benzodiazepines, opioid withdrawal won't kill you. Your body will survive it. But your mind can't comprehend that in the moment. Every cell in your body is screaming that you're dying, that you need the medication right now, that nothing else matters except making this stop. And you know exactly how to make it stop. One pill, just one, and within 30 minutes, all of this suffering will evaporate, the sweating will stop, the muscle aches will fade, your stomach will settle, you'll be able to breathe again. That knowledge sits in your mind like a demon whispering temptation. Take the pill, end the suffering. You're not trying to get high, you're trying to survive. So you take it. And the relief is so immediate, so total, that it reinforces the dependence even more. Your brain logs this experience. Opioid absence equals suffering. Opioid presence equals relief. Do that cycle enough times, and your entire existence becomes organized around avoiding withdrawal. You start counting pills obsessively. You never let your prescription run low. You panic if you're traveling and realize you forgot your medication. You'll drive through a blizzard to pick up your refill because the alternative, withdrawal, is unthinkable. Dependence also means you're taking pills not to feel good but to feel normal. The euphoria from early doses is long gone. Now you're taking OxyContin just to function, to get out of bed, to go to work, to interact with your family without wanting to crawl out of your skin. You're not a recreational drug user chasing highs. You're a person whose physiology has been altered to the point where the drug has become as necessary as food or water. And here's where it gets even darker. Dependence makes you vulnerable to manipulation. Doctors know you can't stop without suffering, so some use that leverage to control your behavior. Miss an appointment, no refill until you come in. Fail a urine test. Prescription cut off. Some patients become so terrified of being cut off that they tolerate humiliating treatment, invasive monitoring, and judgmental lectures just to keep their supply steady. Purdue knew about dependence. They had to. It's basic pharmacology. But their marketing materials barely mentioned it. When they did, they framed it as something distinct from addiction, as if being physically dependent on a drug but not psychologically addicted was somehow better. They told doctors, "Don't confuse dependence with addiction." But for patients, that distinction was meaningless. Whether you called it dependence or addiction, the result was the same. You were trapped. Your body had become a hostage, and the ransom was a never-ending supply of pills. At some point, without realizing it, you cross from patient to addict. You start counting pills. You start hoarding them. You call your doctor early for refills, claiming you lost the bottle. You visit multiple doctors, inventing new injuries. You start buying pills from friends, from strangers, from the internet. You're not trying to get high anymore. You're trying not to get sick. This is addiction, a full-time job you never applied for. The line between dependence and addiction is blurry, debated by experts, and ultimately irrelevant to the person living it. But if you want a clinical definition, here it is. Addiction is when you continue using despite negative consequences. When the drug stops being a solution and becomes a problem, but you can't stop anyway. When you know you're destroying your life, but you take the pill anyway. That's addiction. Maybe it starts with something small. You take an extra pill one particularly bad day, telling yourself it's just this once. Your prescription runs out 2 days early instead of exactly on schedule. You feel a flutter of panic when you realise your refill isn't due yet. So you call the doctor's office with an excuse. You spilled some, your dog ate them, they fell down the drain. The lie comes easily, surprisingly so. You're not a dishonest person, but somehow this feels necessary. The doctor, perhaps suspicious, perhaps just tired, gives you the refill. Crisis averted. But now you've learned something dangerous. Lying works. And next month, when your pills run out 3 days early, you do it again. Different excuse this time. You went out of town and forgot them. Another refill, another successful deception. You tell yourself you're managing your pain, but really you're managing your addiction. Then you start thinking about the pills constantly. Not just when you're in pain, but all the time. You wake up thinking about them. You count and recount them throughout the day. You hide them in multiple locations so you always have access. You start planning your entire life around refill dates. Vacations are scheduled around pharmacy availability. You can't imagine going anywhere. You couldn't get your medication. The pills have become the center of your universe. Your behavior changes in ways your family notices, even if you don't. You become secretive, defensive. When your spouse asks how many pills you took today, you lie. When your kids ask why you're spending so much time in the bathroom, you snap at them. You stop attending family functions because you can't time your doses right, and you're worried people will notice you're not yourself. Or worse, that they will notice you're too yourself, too relaxed, too drowsy, pupils too pinpoint small. Money becomes an issue. OxyContin is expensive, and insurance often won't cover the high doses you need. So you start paying out of pocket. When that becomes unsustainable, you look for alternatives. You find online pharmacies that don't require prescriptions. You connect with dealers who sell diverted pills. You discover that OxyContin on the street goes for $1 per milligram, so an 80 milligram pill costs $80. Your habit becomes more expensive than rent. Some people turn to crime. They steal pills from family members, from friends, from unlocked medicine cabinets at parties. They forge prescriptions. They rob pharmacies. These aren't career criminals. These are teachers, nurses, parents, people who never imagined themselves breaking the law. But addiction has a way of rewriting your moral code. When you're sick and suffering, stealing a few pills from your grandmother's medicine cabinet stops feeling like theft and starts feeling like survival. Others start doctor shopping, visiting multiple physicians and getting prescriptions from each without telling them about the others. It's illegal, but it's also remarkably easy, especially in the early 2000s before prescription monitoring programs existed. You'd see one doctor Monday, another Wednesday, a third Friday, walk out with 3 prescriptions for OxyContin, fill them at different pharmacies. No one notices. Or if they do, no one stops you. And then there are the people who transition to heroin, because at a certain point pills become too expensive, too hard to find, too risky to obtain. But heroin is cheap, plentiful, and gives you the same high. The stigma is enormous. You're a junkie now, not a pain patient. But addiction doesn't care about stigma. It cares about not being sick. So you make the switch, telling yourself it's temporary, that you'll get back on pills soon. But heroin has a gravity all its own, and once you're in, climbing out is nearly impossible. Your life becomes unmanageable. You lose your job because you're nodding off at your desk or missing too much work. Your relationships crumble because you're emotionally unavailable, physically absent or caught in lies. Your health deteriorates. You're constipated constantly. You've lost weight. Your skin looks grey. You don't recognize yourself in the mirror. The person you were before OxyContin feels like a stranger, someone from another lifetime. And the worst part? You know you're addicted. You're not in denial. You can see exactly what's happening to you. You watch yourself make terrible decisions and feel powerless to stop. It's like being a passenger in your own life, screaming at the driver to turn around while they speed toward a cliff. Addiction isn't about lack of awareness. It's about lack of control. The line you crossed wasn't marked. There was no sign, no ceremony, no moment where you consciously decided to become an addict. It happened gradually, quietly, while you were just trying to manage pain, just trying to get through the day, just trying to survive. And now you're on the other side, and the way back looks impossible. By the early 2000s, emergency rooms were filling up. Overdoses were spiking. Doctors started seeing patients who looked wrong. Glassy eyes, slurred speech, track marks. These weren't cancer patients managing end-of-life pain. These were young people, middle-aged parents, teenagers, and they were all on OxyContin. Some doctors pulled back, refusing to prescribe it. Others doubled down, insisting their patients just needed proper management. But the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. OxyContin wasn't a miracle. It was a plague. The first warning signs appeared in small towns, the kind of places where everyone knows everyone and secrets don't stay secret long. Emergency room doctors in rural Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio started seeing a pattern. Overdoses, lots of them. Young people coming in unresponsive, lips blue, breathing shallow. Often, when paramedics searched their pockets or purses, they found pill bottles, OxyContin, prescribed legally by local doctors. Some patients were brought in multiple times. Overdose, revival with naloxone, discharge, repeat a few weeks later. The ER staff started recognizing faces. They'd save someone's life, counsel them about addiction, refer them to treatment, and then see them back in the ER 2 months later having overdosed again. It was demoralizing and terrifying in equal measure. Pharmacists noticed too. They saw the same patients coming in early, for refills month after month. They saw prescriptions written for impossibly high doses, 160 milligrams, 240 milligrams, doses that should only be prescribed for terminal cancer patients, not for someone with a bad back. They saw patients who visited multiple pharmacies trying to fill duplicate prescriptions. Some pharmacists refused to fill the prescriptions. Others called doctors to verify. A few called the police. Within the medical community, whispers started spreading. At conferences, during informal conversations over coffee, doctors shared their concerns. "Are you seeing a lot of OxyContin abuse?" became a common question, and increasingly the answer was yes. Yes, I'm seeing it. Yes, it's getting worse. Yes, I don't know what to do about it. Some doctors stopped prescribing OxyContin cold turkey. They'd had patients die, patients overdose, patients show up in their offices clearly intoxicated and demanding more pills. The liability and the moral weight became too much. They switched to alternative pain medications, referred patients to pain specialists, or simply refused to prescribe opioids at all. Their waiting rooms filled with angry, desperate patients accusing them of abandoning their care. It was an impossible situation, but other doctors didn't stop. Some genuinely believed that the problem was patient education and monitoring, not the drug itself. They implemented stricter protocols, mandatory pill counts, regular urine tests, signed contracts outlining acceptable behavior. They convinced themselves that with proper oversight, OxyContin could still be prescribed safely. They weren't entirely wrong. Some patients did manage long-term opioid therapy without spiraling into addiction. But they were the minority, and the deaths kept coming. Then there were the doctors who didn't care. The ones who ran pill mills, seeing dozens of patients a day, doing cursory exams if any, and writing prescriptions for cash. These weren't legitimate pain management practices. They were drug distribution networks operating under the cover of medical licenses. Patients travelled from multiple states to visit these clinics, waiting in lines that stretched around the block, paying hundreds of dollars in cash for a prescription. The doctors knew exactly what was happening. They just didn't care because they were making millions. Media coverage started picking up on the crisis. Local newspapers in hard-hit areas ran stories about rising overdose deaths. Investigative journalists documented the pill mills, photographed the lines of patients, interviewed grieving families. National outlets began connecting the dots, realizing this wasn't just a regional problem, it was spreading across the country. Terms like opioid epidemic and prescription drug abuse entered the lexicon. Public health officials sounded alarms. The CDC started tracking opioid prescribing rates and overdose deaths, and the numbers were shocking. Between 1999 and 2004, opioid prescriptions tripled. Overdose deaths more than doubled. Emergency room visits related to opioids increased by over 100%. These weren't small upticks. These were exponential surges indicating a systemic crisis. State medical boards began investigating doctors with unusually high prescribing rates. Some had their licenses suspended or revoked. A few were criminally prosecuted. But these actions were reactive, piecemeal, slow. For every pill mill shut down, 2 more opened. For every doctor arrested, a dozen continued prescribing without scrutiny. And through it all, Purdue Pharma maintained their innocence. When confronted with reports of abuse and addiction, they blamed patients for misusing the medication. They blamed doctors for not screening properly. They blamed drug dealers for diverting pills. They blamed everyone except themselves. Their official position remained: OxyContin is safe when used as directed. The problem isn't the drug, it's the people. But the evidence was mounting. Internal emails later revealed that Purdue executives knew about widespread abuse as early as 1997. Sales reps reported it. Law enforcement contacted them. Pharmacists called with concerns. And Purdue's response was to continue marketing aggressively, to fight any efforts at regulation, and to insist publicly that everything was fine. The lie was unraveling, but slowly. Too slowly. Because while doctors debated, regulators investigated, and journalists reported, people kept dying. The epidemic Purdue had created was no longer containable. It had escaped the doctor's office, escaped the pharmacy, and flooded into communities across America. And it was just getting started. In certain parts of America, rural Appalachia, southern Florida, the Rust Belt, a new kind of business emerged: the pill mill. These were pain clinics that existed solely to prescribe opioids. No physical exams, no medical history, just cash up front and a prescription pad. Patients drove hours, sometimes from other states, to wait in line for their monthly supply. Doctors made millions, pharmacies made millions, and the Sacklers still making billions. The term pill mill sounds almost quaint, like something from the Old West. But there was nothing quaint about these operations. They were industrial-scale drug distribution networks operating under the thin veneer of medical practice, and they popped up wherever regulation was lax and demand was high. Southern Florida became ground zero. By the late 2000s, the area around Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach had more pain clinics per capita than anywhere else in the country. Clinics opened in strip malls between nail salons and pizza joints, advertised on billboards along highways, and operated from 8 in the morning until midnight to accommodate the flood of patients. The parking lots were constantly full, license plates from Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Georgia, people driving 8, 10, 12 hours for a 15-minute appointment and a prescription for 240 pills. The business model was brilliantly simple and horrifyingly effective. A doctor, often someone whose license had been disciplined elsewhere or who'd been recruited specifically for this purpose, would rent an office, hire a receptionist and open for business. Patients paid cash, usually $200 or $300 per visit. The doctor would ask a few cursory questions. Where does it hurt? How bad is the pain? Maybe do a token physical exam, and then write prescriptions for OxyContin, Vicodin, Xanax, whatever the patient wanted. The entire appointment lasted 5 to 10 minutes. Some clinics didn't even pretend. Patients filled out a pain questionnaire in the waiting room, handed it to the receptionist along with cash, and received a prescription without ever seeing a doctor. The prescriptions were pre-signed, mass-produced, assembly line medicine at its most cynical. Security guards stood at the doors not to protect staff from violence, but to keep the lines orderly and make sure everyone paid. The volume was staggering. A single pill mill could see 200 patients a day. That's 200 prescriptions, roughly 40,000 pills distributed daily, over 1 million pills a month from one clinic. Multiply that across dozens of clinics, and you start to understand the scale. Pharmacies near these clinics became de facto partners in the operation. They'd stock enormous quantities of opioids, fill prescriptions with minimal questions, and profit from the endless stream of customers. Some clinics also sold the pills directly, operating their own on-site pharmacies. Patients never had to leave the building. They'd see the doctor, get their prescription, walk to the next window and leave with bottles of pills. It was one-stop shopping for addiction. The markup was enormous. Pills that cost the clinic a few dollars to acquire sold for $50 or $60. Everyone was getting rich. The doctors, the pharmacists, the clinic owners, the landlords renting the spaces. Law enforcement struggled to shut them down. Florida had virtually no regulations around pain clinics until 2010. Doctors didn't need special training to prescribe opioids. There was no prescription monitoring program to track doctor shopping. Clinics that got raided would simply reopen under a different name, sometimes in the same location. The prosecutors who tried to build cases found themselves tangled in medical licensing laws, struggling to prove that what looked like drug dealing was actually criminal rather than just bad medicine. Meanwhile, the human cost mounted. Patients who started at pill mills often graduated to more dangerous drugs. Some overdosed in the clinic parking lots. Others died during the long drive home, nodding off at the wheel. The pills obtained legally in Florida flooded northward, sold on streets in Appalachia and the Midwest, fueling addiction in communities that had never seen the inside of a pain clinic. The doctors running these operations weren't misguided healers trying to help people in pain. They were entrepreneurs who'd found a legal way to sell drugs. One Florida doctor later prosecuted for running a pill mill had made $5 million in 2 years. Another was caught on surveillance video partying with patients, doing drugs himself while writing prescriptions. These weren't isolated bad apples. This was a system designed to maximize profit regardless of the body count. And the patients, some were genuinely in pain, desperate for relief, unable to access legitimate care. But many were addicts feeding their dependents, or dealers stocking up for resale. The clinics didn't discriminate. Pain was whatever you said it was, as long as your cash was green. Young men in their 20s with no visible injuries walked out with prescriptions for the highest dose OxyContin available. Pregnant women received prescriptions that would endanger their babies. Teenagers with fake IDs got pills that would kill them within the month. Purdue knew about the pill mills. They had to. Their sales data showed pharmacies near these clinics ordering suspicious quantities. Sales reps reported it. Law enforcement contacted them. And yet the pills kept flowing. Purdue didn't cut off supply to the pharmacies filling these prescriptions. They didn't flag suspicious ordering patterns. They treated the pill mills like any other customer, because from a business perspective, that's exactly what they were. High-volume, reliable customers. Eventually, Florida cracked down. The state implemented emergency regulations, created a prescription monitoring program, and launched a massive enforcement effort. Dozens of pill mills closed. Hundreds of doctors lost their licenses. Some went to prison. Overdose deaths in Florida dropped. Problem solved, right? Wrong. The demand didn't disappear. The addicts didn't suddenly recover. They just switched to heroin. The pill mill crackdown in Florida directly contributed to the surge in heroin use that followed. Close one pipeline, and addiction finds another. Because the problem was never just the clinics. It was the millions of Americans who'd been turned into opioid addicts and had nowhere else to turn. In 2010, under pressure from regulators, Purdue reformulated OxyContin. The new version was supposedly abuse deterrent. It turned into a gummy substance if you tried to crush it. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Addicts didn't quit. They switched. Heroin, which had been fading from American streets, suddenly roared back. It was cheaper than pills, easier to find, and gave the same high. Purdue's solution didn't stop the crisis. It just moved it to the streets. The reformulation was announced with great fanfare. Purdue held press conferences. They published scientific papers. They marketed the new formula as evidence of their commitment to public safety. The pills looked different, harder to break, with a waxy texture that resisted crushing. If you tried to grind them up, they turned into a sticky gel that couldn't be snorted or dissolved for injection. Finally, Purdue claimed, an opioid that couldn't be easily abused. Medical journals praised the innovation. Regulators cautiously welcomed it. Some doctors who'd stopped prescribing OxyContin considered starting again, reassured by the abuse-deterrent properties. It seemed like a genuine step forward, a technological solution to a behavioral problem. If people couldn't crush the pills, they couldn't get high, and maybe the epidemic would start to recede. But Purdue left out one critical detail. Reformulation didn't reduce the addictiveness of the drug itself. OxyContin was still oxycodone, still a powerful opioid, still capable of creating dependence and addiction even when taken exactly as prescribed. The new formula made it harder to abuse, but it did nothing for the millions of people already addicted. And those people needed their drug, so they adapted. Some addicts spent hours learning to defeat the new formula, freezing the pills, microwaving them, dissolving them in Coca-Cola, using pliers and hammers to break them down. It was more difficult, more time-consuming, but where there's addiction, there's ingenuity. Others simply swallowed the pills as intended and accepted the slower, less intense high. The abuse-deterrent formulation was an inconvenience, not a barrier. But for many addicts, especially those who'd been crushing and snorting OxyContin for years, the reformulation was the final straw. Pills became frustrating to work with. They were expensive. Prescriptions were getting harder to obtain as doctors faced increasing scrutiny. And then someone mentioned an alternative: heroin. Heroin wasn't new, obviously. It had been around for over a century. But by the 2000s, it had largely disappeared from many American communities. The crack epidemic had overshadowed it. Law enforcement had disrupted supply chains. The stigma was enormous. Heroin was the drug of junkies, of back alleys and needles, of complete social collapse. Most people who started on prescription opioids would never have considered using heroin. The psychological barrier was too great, until it wasn't. Because chemically, heroin and oxycodone are nearly identical. They're both opioids, both hit the same brain receptors, both produce the same effects. The main difference is legality and stigma. But when you're dope sick, sweating and shaking and desperate, stigma stops mattering. And when someone offers you a bag of heroin for $20 that will do what $80 worth of crushed OxyContin used to do, the decision becomes purely economic. The transition from pills to heroin happened on a massive scale. Studies later showed that nearly 80% of heroin users started with prescription opioids. The reformulation accelerated this shift. Between 2010 and 2013, heroin use increased by nearly 60%. Overdose deaths from heroin more than tripled. The drug that had been fading into obscurity came roaring back, and it was more dangerous than ever. Why more dangerous? Because heroin bought on the street has no quality control. You don't know the purity, you don't know what it's cut with. One bag might be 5% heroin, barely enough to stave off withdrawal. The next might be 40% and kill you. People who'd been carefully managing their opioid intake with pharmaceutical-grade pills suddenly found themselves playing Russian roulette with powder from unknown sources. The method of use changed too. Many people who'd only ever swallowed or snorted pills found themselves injecting heroin because it was more efficient, made the drug last longer, gave a better high. But injection comes with its own horrors. HIV, hepatitis C, bacterial infections, collapsed veins, abscesses. Diseases that had been declining started surging again in communities ravaged by the opioid crisis. Rural areas were hit especially hard. Places that had never seen heroin suddenly had it everywhere. Dealers followed the demand, setting up shop in small towns that lacked the law enforcement resources to fight back. High school parking lots became drug markets, church parking lots, Walmart parking lots. The drug infiltrated communities so thoroughly that parents warned their children about discarded needles in public parks. Purdue's reformulation did achieve one thing. It made crushing OxyContin harder. But it didn't reduce addiction, didn't reduce demand, and didn't reduce death. It just changed the delivery mechanism. Instead of people overdosing on pills in their bathrooms, they were overdosing on heroin in gas station restrooms. Instead of prescription bottles in medicine cabinets, there were bags of powder in coat pockets. The crisis hadn't improved, it had metastasized. And Purdue, they continued selling the reformulated OxyContin, now marketed as a safer option, and continued profiting. The fact that their solution had directly contributed to a heroin epidemic didn't seem to trouble them. They'd moved the problem off their balance sheet and onto America's streets. And from a corporate liability perspective, that was mission accomplished. As heroin flooded back, dealers started cutting it with something even stronger. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times more potent than heroin. A dose the size of a grain of salt could kill. Overdoses exploded. Paramedics carried naloxone, the overdose reversal drug, like soldiers carried ammunition. Families buried children, parents, siblings, and the epidemic that started with a prescription in a doctor's office was now claiming lives by the tens of thousands annually. Fentanyl was originally developed as a medical tool. It's a legitimate pharmaceutical used in hospitals for surgical anesthesia and in patches for severe chronic pain. In controlled medical settings, administered by trained professionals with precise dosing, it's a valuable medication. But on the street, cut into heroin by dealers with no chemistry training, it's a weapon of mass destruction. The math is terrifying. Morphine is the baseline. Heroin is about 2 to 3 times stronger than morphine. OxyContin is about 1.5 times stronger. Fentanyl, 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. A standard dose of heroin might be 30 milligrams. The equivalent fentanyl dose is measured in micrograms, a few grains, invisible to the naked eye. Mix that into a bag of heroin, and you've created something deadly. Why would dealers do this? Economics. Fentanyl is cheap to produce, easy to smuggle. Its potency means you can transport massive doses in tiny packages and incredibly profitable. A kilogram of fentanyl costing a few $1,000s can be cut into hundreds of thousands of doses, each sold for $10 or $20. The profit margins dwarf those of heroin, so dealers started adding it to their supply, sometimes telling customers, often not. The problem is consistency. Mixing fentanyl into heroin requires precision that street dealers don't have. One bag might contain almost no fentanyl, the next might be concentrated enough to kill instantly. Users had no way of knowing. They'd buy from the same dealer they'd used for months, inject what seemed like their normal dose, and die within minutes. Their friends would find them slumped over, needle still in their arm, killed by a drug they didn't even know they were taking. Overdoses skyrocketed. In 2014, there were about 9,000 fentanyl-related deaths in America. By 2017, that number had jumped to 28,000. By 2021, over 70,000. The curve wasn't linear, it was exponential. Fentanyl didn't just add to the crisis, it multiplied it. First responders were overwhelmed. Paramedics and EMTs who'd once dealt with maybe one overdose a week were now responding to multiple calls per shift. They carried naloxone, the opioid reversal drug, in large quantities because fentanyl overdoses often required multiple doses to reverse. A typical heroin overdose might need 2 milligrams of naloxone. A fentanyl overdose might need 4, 6, even 10 milligrams. Some patients required so much naloxone that they'd wake up in severe withdrawal, violent and disoriented. Police officers and firefighters started carrying naloxone too. In some communities, police administered more naloxone than paramedics because they arrived on scene first. They revived people in alleys, in cars, in public bathrooms. Some officers revived the same person multiple times in a single week. It was Sisyphean, save a life today, watch them overdose again tomorrow. Harm reduction advocates distributed naloxone to drug users themselves, train them to recognize overdose symptoms, give them naloxone kits, hope they can save each other, and it worked to a point. Thousands of overdoses were reversed by friends, family members, even strangers. But naloxone is a temporary fix. It wears off in 30 to 90 minutes. If the fentanyl dose was high enough, people could relapse into overdose after the naloxone faded, dying alone after paramedics had already left. Fentanyl also infiltrated other drugs. Dealers started pressing it into counterfeit pills made to look like Xanax, Percocet or OxyContin. People who thought they were buying pharmaceutical pills off the street were actually getting fentanyl. Cocaine started showing up laced with fentanyl. Even methamphetamine was cut with it. Users who'd never touched opioids were dying from fentanyl poisoning because it was in drugs they didn't expect it in. The geographic spread was total. Fentanyl appeared in New England fishing villages and in southern suburbs, in Midwestern farm towns and West Coast cities, rich neighborhoods and poor ones, white communities, black communities, Latino communities. No demographic was spared. The opioid epidemic, which had started with white rural populations, was now killing across every racial, economic, and geographic category. Families were devastated. Parents buried children. Children buried parents. Siblings buried siblings. And the deaths were sudden, shocking. Unlike diseases that progress slowly, giving families time to prepare, fentanyl killed instantly. Someone would go into the bathroom and never come out. A teenager would go to a party and be dead by morning. The grief was compounded by stigma. Overdose death still carried shame, blame, judgment. Families often lied about cause of death to avoid social consequences. Morgues overflowed. In some counties, medical examiners had to rent refrigerated trucks to store bodies because their facilities couldn't handle the volume. Funeral homes ran out of space. Death certificates stacked up faster than coroners could process them. The system, built to handle normal mortality rates, buckled under the weight of an epidemic. And through it all, the pills that started the crisis kept getting prescribed. OxyContin was still on the market. Doctors were still writing opioid prescriptions, though more cautiously. Purdue was still making money. The straight line from a family doctor's office to a fentanyl overdose in a gas station bathroom was clear to anyone willing to look. But looking required acknowledging complicity, and that was too uncomfortable for the institutions and individuals who'd helped create the crisis. Fentanyl became the third wave of the opioid epidemic. Prescription pills were wave 1, heroin was wave 2, fentanyl was wave 3, and it was the deadliest yet. And it all traced back to a little beige pill marketed as safe and non-addictive by a family who put their name on museum wings. By 2015, opioid overdoses were killing more Americans than car accidents, more than gun violence. Small towns held multiple funerals a week. Entire high school graduating classes were decimated. Mothers found their sons dead in bathrooms. Children found their parents cold on couches. And still, for years, no one in power seemed to care, because the victims were often poor, rural, white, and invisible to mainstream media. Until they weren't. Let's put some numbers on the horror. In 1999, the year Purdue really ramped up OxyContin marketing, about 4,000 Americans died from prescription opioid overdoses. By 2010, that number had quadrupled to 16,000. By 2015, it was approaching 25,000. And those numbers only counted prescription opioids, add heroin and fentanyl, and the total overdose deaths exceeded 50,000 annually. 50,000 deaths a year. That's more than the total number of Americans killed during the entire Vietnam War, except this was happening every single year. That's a September 11th attack every 3 weeks. That's a full commercial airliner crashing every single day with no survivors. Use whatever comparison you want, the scale is staggering. But statistics are abstract. Let's talk about what it looked like on the ground. In Huntington, West Virginia, a city of about 50,000 people, there were over 100 overdoses in 1 week in 2016. Paramedics responded to overdose after overdose, reviving people, watching them stumble away, then picking them up again hours later. The city's emergency services nearly collapsed from the strain. In Portsmouth, Ohio, a former industrial town on the banks of the Ohio River, the epidemic was so severe that 1 in 10 babies was born dependent on opioids, requiring specialized neonatal care to manage their withdrawal. These infants, innocent victims of their parents' addictions, would shake, scream, and suffer as their tiny bodies craved drugs they'd been exposed to in the womb. In rural Kentucky, in towns with fewer than 1,000 residents, the high school graduating class photos from the 2000s tell a haunting story. 10 years later, researchers went back and counted how many of those smiling teenagers were still alive. In some classes, 20% were dead. Overdoses mostly, 1 in 5. Entire friend groups wiped out. Families were destroyed, not just by one death, but by multiple. A mother loses her son to an overdose, then 2 years later loses her daughter. A man buries his wife, then his brother, then his best friend. Death compounded, and grief became chronic, inescapable. Support groups for families affected by overdose filled community centres and church basements. Attendees shared stories that were horrifyingly similar. Loved ones who started on prescription pills, graduated to heroin, and died alone. First responders developed PTSD from the sheer volume of death. Paramedics talked about arriving at scenes where they knew the person was gone before they even checked for a pulse. Lips blue, skin cold, rigor mortis already setting in. But they go through the motions anyway, attempting resuscitation, administering naloxone, hoping for a miracle that never came. After a while, some couldn't take it anymore. They'd quit, burned out by grief and futility. Coroners and medical examiners were overwhelmed. In Montgomery County, Ohio, which includes Dayton, the coroner's office handled over 300 overdose deaths in 2016 alone. They had to store bodies in refrigerated trailers because their morgue wasn't big enough. Toxicology tests, which determine exact cause of death, were backlogged for months. Death certificates piled up unsigned because there weren't enough staff to process them. The financial cost was staggering. States spent billions on emergency services, addiction treatment, foster care for children whose parents overdosed, and law enforcement. Hospitals wrote off millions in unreimbursed care for overdose patients who couldn't pay. Employers lost productive workers. Social Security paid out billions in disability for people too addicted to function. But money is secondary to the human cost, the lost potential, the children who grew up without parents, the parents who buried their children, the partners who became widows and widowers decades before they should have, the friends who watched their circles shrink, one funeral at a time. And through all of this, the response from government was slow, inadequate, and fragmented. The FDA continued approving new opioid formulations. Congress held hearings but passed little meaningful legislation. The DEA prosecuted some pill mill doctors but left the pharmaceutical companies largely untouched. Treatment facilities were overwhelmed, underfunded, often for-profit operations that provided substandard care. Insurance companies made it nearly impossible to get treatment. Many plans wouldn't cover long-term residential rehab or medication-assisted treatment. They'd pay for a week of detox and then cut people loose, still addicted, still suffering, with no support system. Predictably, most relapsed within days or weeks. Some died during that relapse because their tolerance had dropped during detox, and they overdosed on doses they used to handle easily. The stigma remained crushing. People were embarrassed to admit family members had died of overdoses. Obituaries used euphemisms, died suddenly, died unexpectedly, lost their battle with addiction, anything to avoid saying the word overdose. At funerals, well-meaning relatives whispered that at least the person was at peace now, as if addiction were a choice rather than a disease. And still the deaths mounted. Year after year, the numbers climbed. Local news stopped reporting individual overdoses because there were too many. They became background noise, a tragic normalcy. Communities became numb to loss because there was simply too much of it to process. Grief fatigue set in. The American medical establishment had unleashed something it couldn't control. A legal, FDA-approved medication had killed more Americans than any terrorist attack, any war, any natural disaster in recent history. And the people who made it, marketed it, and profited from it faced no real consequences for years. The bodies piled up, and somewhere in a mansion, the Sacklers counted their billions. Not everyone at Purdue stayed silent. Sales reps quit in disgust. Doctors came forward. Activists demanded investigations. One Purdue employee later testified that company executives knew OxyContin was being abused as early as 1997 but did nothing. They knew, and they kept selling. The first cracks in Purdue's facade came from the inside, from people who couldn't live with what they were seeing. Sales representatives who'd been enthusiastically pushing OxyContin suddenly found themselves wrestling with guilt. They'd see their territories on maps of overdose deaths and realize they'd helped create those statistics. Some kept working, compartmentalizing their role. Others couldn't stomach it. One sales rep later testified that during internal meetings, managers would joke about towns they'd blown out, saturated with prescriptions until the market couldn't absorb more. They celebrated hitting sales targets while people in those same towns were dying. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable for some. They'd quit, often without another job lined up, just to escape the moral weight of what they were doing. These whistleblowers faced retaliation. Purdue threatened lawsuits, claiming former employees were violating confidentiality agreements. Some were blacklisted in the pharmaceutical industry, their names passed around as troublemakers, their careers suffered. But they spoke anyway, to journalists, to lawyers, to prosecutors, because staying silent felt like complicity. One of the most damning whistleblowers was a woman named Carol Panara, a former Purdue supervisor. She testified that the company trained sales reps to downplay addiction risks and to specifically target doctors who were high prescribers of opioids. These doctors weren't necessarily the best physicians. They were the most willing to write prescriptions with minimal scrutiny. Purdue identified them through data, tracked them, cultivated relationships with them, and funneled resources toward them. It was targeted marketing aimed at the most vulnerable points in the medical system. Doctors started coming forward too. Primary care physicians who'd once prescribed OxyContin liberally now publicly admitted they'd been misled. They described the training they'd received, the materials they'd been given, the reassurances about safety. Some wrote opinion pieces in medical journals confessing their role and warning other doctors. It was an act of professional courage. Admitting you contributed to an epidemic risks your reputation and even your license. Dr. Art Van Zee, a rural physician in Virginia, was one of the earliest and most vocal critics. He watched his small community ravaged by OxyContin addiction and started documenting the crisis. He wrote letters to Purdue, to regulators, to anyone who would listen, detailing what he was seeing. He was dismissed, ignored, told he was exaggerating. But he kept gathering evidence, kept speaking out. Years later, his early warnings were vindicated. Activists and community organizers became whistleblowers in their own right. In hard-hit regions, mothers who'd lost children formed groups like Fed Up, Coalition and Faces and Voices of Recovery. They held protests outside Purdue headquarters. They confronted Sackler family members at public events. They disrupted medical conferences where Purdue was sponsoring talks. They made noise, refusing to let the crisis be ignored or downplayed. These activists dug through public records, tracked prescribing patterns, and connected dots that regulators and journalists had missed. They identified pill mills before law enforcement did. They documented which pharmacies were dispensing suspicious quantities. They became citizen investigators, driven by grief and rage. Inside Purdue, some employees documented what they were seeing: emails, meeting notes, sales reports, evidence that would later prove crucial in legal cases. These documents showed that executives knew about abuse, that they'd discussed it in meetings, that they'd made conscious decisions to continue aggressive marketing despite the evidence of harm. One particularly damning internal email from 2001 showed a Purdue executive writing that OxyContin was being described as heroin in a pill. Rather than expressing alarm, the email discussed strategies to contain the perception, not to fix the problem, but to manage the public relations fallout. That email would later be cited in lawsuits and criminal proceedings as evidence of knowledge and intent. Government whistleblowers emerged too. FDA officials who'd been sidelined when they raised concerns about OxyContin came forward years later. They described internal pressure to approve the drug, to grant favourable labelling, to not ask too many questions. Some had been reassigned or pushed out after pushing back. Their stories revealed that the regulatory failure wasn't just incompetence, it was institutional capture, where the agency meant to protect the public had become too cosy with the industry it regulated. Journalists who'd been investigating Purdue for years became whistleblowers in their own way, publishing exposés that Purdue tried to suppress. Barry Meyer of the New York Times wrote a book called Painkillers in 2003, documenting the early stages of the crisis. Purdue's lawyers pressured his publisher, resulting in a softened second edition, but the story was out, and other journalists picked up the thread. These whistleblowers, sales reps, doctors, activists, employees, regulators, journalists didn't stop the crisis. The machine was too big, too profitable, too entrenched. But they created a record, a paper trail of truth that couldn't be erased. When the lawsuits finally came, when prosecutors built their cases, the evidence these whistleblowers had preserved became crucial. They documented the crime in real time, even when no one was listening. Coming forward cost them. Some lost jobs, careers, friendships. Some were sued or threatened. Some faced social backlash in communities where Purdue was seen as a job creator, an economic engine. But they spoke anyway, driven by conscience, by grief, by the fundamental belief that silence is complicity. And eventually, the world started listening. In the mid-2000s, lawsuits started trickling in. Then they became a flood. Families who lost children, states drowning in addiction treatment costs, cities where entire neighbourhoods had been hollowed out. They all sued Purdue, the Sacklers, and anyone involved. The legal battles would take decades, but the message was clear. Someone had to pay. The first lawsuits were small, brought by individual families who'd lost loved ones to OxyContin overdoses. A mother whose son died at 23. A widower whose wife became addicted after a back surgery. These plaintiffs weren't wealthy. They couldn't afford high-powered legal teams. Many represented themselves or worked with small local attorneys who took cases on contingency. The legal system wasn't built for them. It was built for corporations with infinite resources and armies of lawyers. Purdue crushed these early cases. They'd file motion after motion, drag out discovery for years, bury plaintiffs in paperwork, and outlast them financially and emotionally. Even when cases went to trial, Purdue's defense was consistent. The patient misused the medication. The doctor overprescribed. We provided adequate warnings. It's not our fault. Juries, unsure how to assign blame in such complex cases, often sided with the pharmaceutical company. After all, the FDA had approved OxyContin. Doctors had prescribed it. How could the manufacturer be responsible? But around 2004, the nature of the litigation changed. States started suing. West Virginia filed one of the first major state actions, arguing that Purdue's deceptive marketing had created a public health crisis that was costing taxpayers millions in healthcare, law enforcement, and social services. This was a different kind of plaintiff, a sovereign entity with subpoena power, deep pockets, and political will. Other states quickly followed. Kentucky, where OxyContin abuse was rampant, sued in 2007. The lawsuit alleged that Purdue had systematically misled doctors and patients about addiction risks. state attorneys general, many facing re-election in communities devastated by the opioid crisis, saw these lawsuits as both moral imperatives and political opportunities. They weren't just seeking damages, they were seeking accountability. Cities and counties joined in. They argued they'd borne the brunt of the crisis, police responding to overdoses, jails filled with addicts, child welfare systems overwhelmed by opioid-orphaned children, budgets strained to the breaking point. Places like Everett, Washington, and Huntington, West Virginia, filed lawsuits detailing the specific harm OxyContin had caused their communities. These weren't abstract legal theories, they were itemized lists of costs, names of the dead, statistics of lives destroyed. By 2017, the trickle had become a flood. Over 2,000 lawsuits were filed against Purdue and other opioid manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacies. The cases were consolidated into multi-district litigation, a legal mechanism for handling mass torts. A single federal judge in Ohio oversaw most of them, trying to wrangle thousands of plaintiffs, hundreds of defendants, and millions of pages of evidence into something manageable. The legal discovery process became a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Plaintiffs' attorneys subpoenaed internal Purdue documents and found what whistleblowers had been saying for years. The company knew. Emails showed executives discussing abuse. Sales data showed they'd targeted vulnerable populations. Marketing materials revealed deliberate strategies to downplay addiction risks. Every document strengthened the case that Purdue hadn't just made a mistake, they'd engineered a public health catastrophe, knowingly and intentionally. Native American tribes filed lawsuits too. Reservations had been devastated by OxyContin, with overdose rates far exceeding national averages. The Cherokee Nation sued multiple pharmaceutical companies, arguing that the opioid epidemic was genocide by another name, a deliberate poisoning of indigenous populations for profit. Their lawsuit was raw, angry, and deeply personal, framing the crisis not just as corporate malfeasance, but as a continuation of historical trauma. Hospitals sued. They'd absorbed millions in unreimbursed costs treating overdose patients. Health insurance companies sued, seeking to recover money spent on addiction treatment and overdose care. Even babies born dependent on opioids, or rather their legal guardians, filed lawsuits, arguing they'd been harmed before they were even born. The legal theories varied. Product liability. OxyContin was defectively designed and inadequately warned. Fraud. Purdue lied about addiction risks. Public nuisance. The company created a hazardous condition affecting entire communities. Racketeering. Purdue operated like a criminal enterprise, using deceptive practices to push drugs. Some lawsuits name the Sackler family members individually, piercing the corporate veil to go after personal fortunes. Purdue's legal strategy was delay, deny, and defend. They hired the best law firms money could buy, firms that charged $1,000 an hour and fielded teams of dozens of attorneys. They fought every discovery request, every motion, every deposition. They argued that plaintiffs couldn't prove causation, that specific OxyContin pills caused specific harms. They blamed everyone else, rogue doctors, pill mills, street dealers, patients who didn't follow instructions. But the sheer volume of litigation overwhelmed even Purdue's resources. The company was fighting on hundreds of fronts simultaneously. Legal fees were bleeding them dry, and the evidence kept mounting. Former employees testified. Internal documents leaked. Experts testified about the pharmacology of addiction, dismantling Purdue's claims that OxyContin was less addictive than other opioids. Public opinion shifted. Media coverage of the lawsuits was extensive and damning. The Sacklers, once celebrated philanthropists, became pariahs. Museums began distancing themselves from the family name. Protesters showed up at Sackler family events. The court of public opinion had convicted them even as legal cases ground slowly through the system. In 2007, Purdue and 3 executives pleaded guilty to federal charges of misbranding OxyContin by claiming it was less addictive than other opioids. They paid $635 million in fines, at the time one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in history. But no one went to prison. The executives paid fines out of their personal fortunes and moved on. The company treated the settlement as a cost of doing business. The guilty plea should have been a watershed moment. Instead, it was barely a speed bump. Purdue continued selling OxyContin, the Sacklers remained billionaires, and the crisis continued to worsen. The lawsuits multiplied, each one representing not just legal claims but human tragedy. Lives lost, families destroyed, communities shattered. The plaintiffs weren't looking for revenge, though some wanted it. They were looking for acknowledgement, for accountability, for someone to finally say, yes, this was wrong, and yes, we are responsible. The legal battles would drag on for another decade, through bankruptcies and appeals and negotiations. But the message had been sent. Families, states, cities, tribes, they were fighting back, and they weren't going to stop until someone paid. Purdue's legal strategy was textbook corporate villainy. Deny responsibility. Blame doctors for overprescribing. Blame patients for misusing the drug. Claim the science was sound. Settle quietly when possible. Fight publicly when necessary. And above all, protect the family fortune. When the first lawsuits hit, Purdue's response was immediate and well rehearsed. We did nothing wrong. OxyContin is a safe and effective medication when used as directed. The problem isn't our drug, it's the people who abuse it. This became their mantra, repeated in court filings, press releases, and congressional testimony. They positioned themselves as victims, unfairly blamed for a societal problem they didn't create. Their first line of defense was to blame patients. People who became addicted had misused the medication. They'd taken more than prescribed, crushed and snorted the pills, or obtained them illegally. Purdue's lawyers would dissect individual cases, looking for any deviation from the prescription instructions. Did the patient take 3 pills in one day instead of 2? That's misuse. Did they continue taking OxyContin after their prescription ended? That's drug-seeking behavior. The company painted addicts as moral failures rather than victims of a pharmaceutical product that did exactly what it was designed to do: create dependence. When blaming patients didn't work, they blamed doctors. Physicians overprescribed, Purdue argued. They didn't properly screen patients for addiction risk. They didn't monitor closely enough. They ignored warning signs. It was medical malpractice, not corporate malfeasance. Purdue's marketing materials, their sales tactics, their incentive structures, none of that mattered, they claimed. Doctors were trained professionals who made independent decisions. If those decisions were bad, that was on the doctors, not the company supplying the drugs. When blaming doctors didn't work, they blamed drug dealers and pill mills. Purdue acknowledged there was an abuse problem, but insisted it was driven by criminal diversion, pills being stolen, resold on the street, obtained through fraud. They pointed to pill mills as evidence that the problem was law enforcement, not pharmaceutical manufacturing. They positioned themselves as allies in fighting abuse, offering to help develop tracking systems and abuse deterrent formulations, all while continuing to flood the market with pills. Purdue's legal team also attacked the science behind the lawsuits. They'd hire expert witnesses, often doctors on their payroll, to testify that OxyContin was appropriately marketed, that the addiction risks were disclosed, that any claims to the contrary were unsupported by evidence. They'd cite studies, many of which Purdue had funded, showing that opioids could be used safely for chronic pain. They'd argue that the less than 1% addiction statistic, while perhaps oversimplified, was based on legitimate research. When scientific arguments failed, they turned to procedure. Purdue's lawyers filed endless motions to dismiss, arguing that plaintiffs lacked standing, that statutes of limitations had expired, that claims were preempted by federal law, that evidence should be excluded. They'd challenge every expert, every document, every testimony. They'd appeal every adverse ruling, dragging cases through the courts for years. The goal wasn't necessarily to win, it was to exhaust the opposition, to make litigation so expensive and time-consuming that plaintiffs would give up. For plaintiffs without deep pockets, this strategy was devastatingly effective. Individual families couldn't afford years of litigation. Small law firms couldn't sustain the financial burden of fighting a company with unlimited resources. Many cases were dropped or settled for nuisance amounts, a few $100,000 with confidentiality agreements that prevented plaintiffs from discussing the terms. Purdue would essentially pay people to go away quietly, but Purdue also knew when to fold. In cases where the evidence was particularly damning, where juries seemed sympathetic, where publicity would be bad, they'd settle, always with strict confidentiality clauses. They'd pay millions to make specific cases disappear, ensuring that damaging testimony never became public, that incriminating documents remained sealed, that precedents couldn't be established. These quiet settlements allowed Purdue to avoid admitting guilt while eliminating legal threats. The company also lobbied aggressively. They donated to political campaigns, hired former regulators as consultants, funded think tanks that published pro-opioid research. They worked behind the scenes to shape legislation, to weaken enforcement, to protect their market position. When the DEA tried to crack down on suspicious pill shipments, Purdue and other pharmaceutical companies pushed Congress to pass laws limiting the DEA's authority. And it worked. The regulations were weakened. Purdue's public relations strategy was equally calculated. They'd issue statements expressing sympathy for addiction victims while maintaining their innocence. They'd announce new abuse deterrent formulations, framing themselves as part of the solution. They'd fund addiction treatment programs using a tiny fraction of their profits to create positive press. It was reputation management designed to muddy the waters, to make people think, well, maybe they're not all bad. Throughout it all, the Sackler family remained mostly hidden. They didn't testify. They didn't give interviews. They let Purdue's executives and lawyers be the public face of the company. When pressed, they'd claim they were merely investors, not involved in day-to-day operations. Internal documents later proved this was false. Sackler family members were deeply involved in strategic decisions, including marketing tactics and lobbying efforts. But by maintaining distance, they hoped to shield their personal fortunes from legal liability. The strategy worked for years. Purdue paid some fines, settled some cases, but continued operating profitably. The Sacklers remained billionaires. OxyContin remained on the market, and the death toll kept rising. Deny, deflect, delay. It bought them time, money, and impunity. But eventually the walls started closing in. The evidence was too damning, the body count was too high, public outrage was too intense. Even the best legal defense couldn't hold back the inevitable forever. As the lawsuits mounted, the Sacklers began transferring billions of dollars out of Purdue and into offshore accounts, family trusts, and shell companies. By the time Purdue declared bankruptcy in 2019, the family had already secured their wealth. They weren't going to jail. They were going to remain billionaires. The transfer started around 2007, right after Purdue's guilty plea on federal misbranding charges. That settlement should have been a wake-up call, a sign that the legal threats were serious. For the Sacklers, it was a wake-up call of a different kind. Get the money out before someone tries to take it. Between 2008 and 2018, the Sackler family withdrew over $10 billion from Purdue Pharma. $10 billion. They moved it through a complex web of transactions designed to obscure the trail. Money went from Purdue to Sackler-controlled holding companies, then to offshore accounts in places like Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, then into trusts and LLCs with opaque ownership structures. It was financial engineering at its most sophisticated, executed by the best lawyers and accountants money could buy. The mechanics were clever. Purdue would declare massive distributions to its owners, the Sackler family. These distributions were technically legal. The family owned the company and was entitled to its profits. But the timing and scale were suspicious. Purdue was withdrawing cash at unprecedented rates even as lawsuits piled up, and the company's future looked increasingly precarious. They were looting the ship before it sank. Some money went into foreign holding companies that had no operational purpose except to hold assets beyond the reach of US courts. Other funds went into trusts structured so that beneficiaries had no legal control, making it harder for courts to seize them. The Sacklers created multiple layers of insulation, ensuring that even if Purdue went bankrupt, even if judgments were entered against the company, the family wealth would be untouchable. They also used the money to buy assets that are difficult to value and harder to liquidate. Real estate in exclusive neighborhoods, fine art collections, luxury goods. These purchases served dual purposes. They diversified the family's holdings, and they made it harder for courts to calculate exactly how much wealth the Sacklers had extracted. How do you value a rare painting? How do you force someone to sell their mansion? It's legally complex and time-consuming, which was exactly the point. State attorneys general eventually caught on. When they started investigating Purdue's finances, they discovered the billions that had been siphoned off. They were furious. Here were states struggling to fund addiction treatment programs, communities overwhelmed by overdose deaths, and the Sacklers had quietly moved their fortune out of reach. Prosecutors called it a fraudulent transfer, an attempt to evade future liabilities. They filed motions to claw back the money, to pierce the corporate veil, to hold family members personally liable. But the legal system moved slowly. The Sacklers had years of head start. By the time court started examining the transfers, much of the money had already been moved multiple times, laundered through legitimate transactions, and embedded in legal structures that would take years to unwind. Some transfers fell outside the statute of limitations. Others were deemed legitimate business distributions. The Sacklers' lawyers argued that the family had every right to take profits from their own company. In 2019, facing thousands of lawsuits and mounting liabilities, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. The filing was strategic, designed to consolidate all litigation into a single bankruptcy proceeding, where outcomes could be controlled. Bankruptcy law is kinder to corporations than regular civil litigation. It allows for global settlements, releases from liability, and restructuring that can benefit owners even as the company dissolves. But here's the cynical brilliance. Purdue declared bankruptcy while the Sacklers remained solvent. The company was broke. The family was not. Purdue had assets worth maybe $2 billion. The Sacklers had extracted $10 billion. They'd hollowed out the company, taken the cash, and left behind an empty shell to face the creditors. Victims and their families were outraged. States rejected initial settlement proposals. Advocates protested outside bankruptcy hearings. The idea that the Sacklers could bankrupt their company, shield their personal wealth, and avoid accountability was unconscionable. But bankruptcy law gave them leverage. They could offer to contribute some of their personal money to the settlement pot in exchange for releases from liability. Take this deal, they essentially said, or get nothing. The negotiations dragged on for years. States wanted more money. They wanted the Sacklers to admit wrongdoing. They wanted personal accountability. The Sacklers refused. They'd contribute billions to a settlement fund, not an admission of liability, just a donation to resolve claims, and they wanted complete immunity from future lawsuits. Take it or leave it. Meanwhile, the Sacklers continued living in luxury. They maintained estates in multiple countries. They attended exclusive social events. They enjoyed their art collections. While families buried their children, while communities struggled with addiction, the Sacklers lived as they always had, insulated by wealth, buffered by lawyers, untouchable. Some of the transferred money was eventually clawed back. Courts forced the Sacklers to return a few $100 million. But most remained beyond reach. The offshore accounts, the foreign trusts, the complex corporate structures, they'd done their job. The family had successfully protected the bulk of their fortune. It was a masterclass in financial self-preservation. They'd made their money from OxyContin, then used that money to build legal and financial fortresses around themselves. They'd turned profits into protection, millions into moats, and when the reckoning came, when courts and prosecutors finally came calling, the Sacklers were already safe behind walls made of Swiss bank accounts and Cayman Island trusts. The escape plan had worked. The family would lose some wealth, suffer some reputational damage, but they'd remain rich, comfortable, free, and the victims. They'd get a fraction of what was owed, distributed through a bankruptcy process that prioritized legal efficiency over justice. The Sacklers had bought their way out of accountability, one wire transfer at a time. In 2021, a bankruptcy judge approved a deal. The Sacklers would pay $4.5 billion over 9 years, and in exchange they would receive legal immunity from all future opioid-related lawsuits. They admitted no wrongdoing. They faced no criminal charges. They kept their fortune. Victims' families were offered pennies, and the Sacklers walked away. The bankruptcy proceedings took place in a federal courthouse in White Plains, New York. For months, lawyers representing states, municipalities, tribes, and individual victims negotiated with Perdue's bankruptcy team and the Sacklers' attorneys. The central question wasn't whether Perdue would dissolve. That was a given. The question was, what happens to the Sackler family? Perdue proposed a settlement structure. The company would be dissolved and reformed as a public benefit corporation, its profits directed toward addiction treatment. The Sacklers would contribute $4.5 billion from their personal fortune to a settlement fund. That money would be distributed to states, local governments, and victims. In exchange, the Sackler family would receive complete immunity from all civil litigation related to opioids. Forever. No one could ever sue them again. 4.5 billion sounds like a lot. It made headlines. Sacklers to pay billions in opioid settlement. But context matters. The family had extracted over $10 billion from Perdue. They were offering less than half of what they'd taken, and they'd keep the rest. Plus, the payment structure was spread over 9 years. They weren't writing a check. They were making installments, allowing them to earn interest on money they hadn't yet paid, while inflation eroded the real value of their contributions. Victim advocates were horrified. Families who'd lost children showed up at bankruptcy hearings and testified. They described burying their sons and daughters. They talked about the financial devastation, funeral costs, lost income, medical bills from failed rehab attempts. They explained that the proposed settlement would give them maybe $5,000 to $30,000, depending on their circumstances. That was the price tag the Sacklers had put on their children's lives. Ryan Hampton, an advocate and recovering addict, testified that the settlement was insulting. He pointed out that the Sacklers would remain billionaires while families who'd lost everything would get checks that couldn't even cover a year of addiction treatment. He called it a betrayal, a legal fiction, that allowed the richest to buy their way out of accountability while the poorest bore the consequences. Some states rejected the deal. Washington and several others argued that allowing non-debtors, the Sackler family members who hadn't personally filed for bankruptcy, to receive immunity was illegal and immoral. Bankruptcy law is supposed to give the bankrupt entity a fresh start. It's not supposed to shield wealthy owners who stripped assets before the company collapsed. But most states reluctantly accepted. They needed the money. Addiction treatment programs were underfunded. Foster care systems were overwhelmed. States had spent billions responding to the crisis and desperately needed reimbursement. The alternative, continuing to litigate for years, maybe decades, would cost more and might yield less. The Sacklers had them over a barrel. The judge overseeing the bankruptcy, Robert Drain, approved the settlement in September 2021. He acknowledged that it wasn't perfect, that many victims felt betrayed, but he concluded it was the best outcome available. The $4.5 billion would do more good than continued litigation. The Sacklers would lose billions in their reputation. That was accountability, even if it wasn't justice. But there was another twist. The Sacklers didn't have to admit guilt. The settlement agreement explicitly stated that their contributions were not an admission of wrongdoing. They maintained their innocence. They framed the payment as a generous donation to help solve a crisis they didn't cause. It was galling, profiting from addiction, draining the company, then offering back a fraction and calling it charity. The immunity was sweeping, not just immunity from existing lawsuits, but from any future claims. A teenager who'd been prescribed OxyContin and later became addicted couldn't sue the Sacklers when they turned 18. A child born dependent on opioids couldn't sue when they grew up and learned what had been done to them. The Sacklers had bought eternal legal protection. Appeals were filed immediately. Victims' rights groups argued that bankruptcy courts didn't have authority to grant immunity to non-debtors. The Department of Justice opposed the deal. The case wound through the appellate system. In late 2023, the Supreme Court heard arguments. The question was narrow but important. Can bankruptcy judges grant immunity to people who didn't file for bankruptcy? While the appeals played out, the Sacklers remained in limbo. Wealthy, comfortable limbo, but limbo nonetheless. They'd agreed to pay, but hadn't yet received their immunity. If the courts overturned the bankruptcy deal, they'd be vulnerable again to thousands of lawsuits. For the first time in years, they faced uncertainty. But even if the deal collapsed, the damage was done. The Sacklers had moved their money. They'd built their legal fortresses. They'd played the system masterfully. And they'd revealed something dark about American justice. If you're rich enough, if you hire the right lawyers, if you structure things cleverly enough, you can engineer mass death, profit from suffering, and walk away with billions in immunity. The bankruptcy deal wasn't justice. It was a transaction. The Sacklers traded money for freedom, paid billions to avoid accountability, and emerged on the other side still wealthy, still free, still untouched by criminal law. They turned the legal system into a marketplace where guilt could be negotiated, liability could be purchased away, and consequences were optional for those who could afford the price. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in a world where painkillers come with warning labels and prescription monitoring systems track every pill, maybe take a moment to think about the hundreds of thousands who never got that protection. The people who walked into their doctor's office with back pain and walked out with a prescription that would destroy their lives. The parents who trusted the medical system and lost their children. The children who lost their parents. The communities that were hollowed out one overdose at a time. The OxyContin story isn't ancient history. It's not a medieval plague or a long-forgotten disaster. This happened in our lifetimes. It happened to our neighbours, our co-workers, our family members. It happened in towns and cities across America, while pharmaceutical executives attended galas and museum openings. It happened while the Sackler name was being carved into marble walls at the world's most prestigious institutions. It happened in plain sight, with FDA approval, with doctors' signatures, with the full blessing of a system that prioritized profit over people. And here's the thing that should keep us awake, even as we're trying to fall asleep. It worked. The Sacklers made billions. They lived in mansions. They collected art. They donated to museums and had their names celebrated. And when the bodies started piling up, when the evidence became undeniable, when prosecutors and lawyers finally came knocking, they didn't go to prison. They didn't lose everything. They negotiated. They paid a fraction of what they'd taken. They shielded their wealth, and they walked away. Over 500,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses since OxyContin launched in 1996. 500,000. That's more than every American combat death in World War II. It's more than the entire population of Atlanta. It's a mid-sized American city completely erased. And it all started with a lie so simple, so profitable, and so deadly. This pill is safe. But maybe the most haunting part isn't the death toll. It's how preventable it all was. At every stage people knew. Sales reps reported abuse. Doctors raised concerns. Pharmacists saw the warning signs. Community advocates screamed into the void. Whistleblowers came forward. And at every stage, those warnings were ignored, suppressed, or dismissed because acknowledging them would have meant less money, less growth, less profit. The system chose wealth over lives, over and over again, until the crisis was too big to hide. The epidemic continues. OxyContin prescriptions have dropped. Yes. Purdue Pharma no longer exists in its original form. The Sackler's reputation lies in ruins, but fentanyl still floods American streets. People still overdose every day. Families still bury their children. The monster that Purdue created has evolved, mutated, and spread far beyond their control. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. You can't unaddict millions of people. You can't bring back the dead. And yet, somehow, life goes on. Communities rebuild. Families grieve and survive. First responders keep responding. Treatment centers keep trying to save lives. And every person who makes it through another day sober, who fights their addiction, and wins even one small battle, is proof that humans are stubborn, resilient, and remarkably hard to destroy completely. The OxyContin story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and pitchforks. Sometimes it comes in a suit and tie. Sometimes it donates to museums. Sometimes it gets FDA approval. Sometimes it's prescribed by your family doctor with good intentions and terrible information. Evil can be banal, bureaucratic, and incredibly profitable. And sometimes the people who cause the most harm sleep just fine at night in their man-suites, convinced they did nothing wrong. But history has a way of correcting the record. The Sacklers wanted to be remembered as great philanthropists, patrons of culture, benefactors of humanity. Instead, they'll be remembered as the family that sparked one of the deadliest drug epidemics in American history, made billions in the process, and bought their way out of accountability. Their name, once proudly displayed on museum walls, is now a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when we let corporations dictate public health policy, when we trust profit-driven companies to regulate themselves, when we assume that wealth equals virtue and philanthropy erases sin. So as you close your eyes tonight, maybe think about the anonymous victims, the ones who never made headlines, never got settlements, never saw justice. The young man who overdosed in a Walmart bathroom, the mother found dead with her children sleeping in the next room, the teenager who never made it to graduation, the veteran who survived war but not his pain medication. Each one a whole universe of potential, of love, of dreams snuffed out by a drug that was supposed to help them. And maybe, just maybe, remember that systems don't change by themselves. They change because people demand it, because activists protest, because journalists investigate, because prosecutors bring cases, because ordinary people refuse to accept that this is just how things are. The Sacklers didn't lose their reputation because the universe suddenly decided to deliver justice. They lost it because people fought year after year to hold them accountable. We can't bring back the dead. We can't undo the damage. But we can refuse to forget. We can tell the story. We can remember their names, not the Sacklers' names on museum walls, but the names of the victims carved into gravestones across America. We can demand better. We can build systems that protect people instead of profits. We can be the generation that learns from this catastrophe instead of repeating it. Because somewhere tonight, right now, someone is holding a pill bottle, deciding whether to take one more than prescribed. Someone is sitting in a doctor's office, about to receive their first opioid prescription. Someone is standing at the edge, wondering if they can survive one more day of withdrawal. And the decisions we make, as a society, as citizens, as humans, will determine whether they get help or become another statistic. The OxyContin epidemic taught us that American medicine can be corrupted, that regulatory agencies can be captured, that wealth can buy almost anything, including immunity from consequences. But it also taught us that truth eventually surfaces, that courage exists among ordinary people, that families who've lost everything can still find the strength to fight, that systems can change when enough people demand it. So rest tonight, knowing that you live in a world that's slightly more aware, slightly more cautious, slightly more willing to question authority and corporate promises. It's not perfect. The fight isn't over. But it's better than it was. And maybe, in remembering this story, in refusing to let it fade into comfortable amnesia, we honour the people who didn't survive it. Sleep well. You've earned it. Because unlike those who came before, you're not trapped in the dark days when doctors handed out addiction like candy and called it compassion. You're in a world that knows better now. A world that learned the hardest possible way that not every pill is safe, not every doctor is right, and not every billionaire deserves their name on a museum wall. And if you remember nothing else from tonight's story, remember this. The people who died from OxyContin didn't fail. The system failed them. They trusted doctors, followed prescriptions, believed the promises. They did everything right in a world that was lying to them. Their deaths weren't weakness. They were betrayal. Good night. And may we all wake up tomorrow in a world that chooses people over profits, truth over marketing, and justice over convenience. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the alternative is measured in bodies, counted in the hundreds of thousands, and written in the permanent record as one of the great American tragedies, preventable, predictable, and inexcusably profitable. Sleep tight. The fight continues tomorrow.